In the last lecture, we made sure that we show a spinner, a loader, to the user whilst the request is on its way. That's of course a good thing to do. It improves our user experience because the user clearly sees that something is happening. It's also an improvement to the user experience if we show error messages in case something fails. And here again, there are different places where you could show such an error message. I simply want to set up some global error handler which shows a modal with the error message but doesn't use the modal here because I don't want to be stuck to this container, to the Burger Builder container. I want to have a flexible way of showing an error no matter in which component and which container it occurs. So therefore, my modal is going to get added to a higher level in the application, and I want to have a higher level of the application, so some higher component than this Burger Builder container where I catch errors and where I then make sure that my error modal is displayed. Now, where can we set this up? How can we control this? I simply want to create a higher order component with which I can wrap the Burger Builder, or which I'll actually use in that second way I showed you for using higher order components, so that we can simply wrap any component which should have this error modal with it and can conveniently add the error handling functionality to it. So for this, I'm going to create my new higher order component in a folder which I'll name with error handler. I'm using this syntax with error handler because I want to use this second way of creating a higher order component, which will be used here on the export and not used as JSX code. So in there, I'll add a with error handler.js file. And this file here now will take the following form. It will be a function with error handler, and this should be a function which takes the wrapped component as an input and which then returns a function which receives props and of course simply returns some JSX including the wrapped component. So for that we need to import React from React. And now here I of course want to return the wrapped component and distribute any props this component might receive on it, because I don't know these props, but I definitely don't want to lose them. I then want to export this with error handler function as the default, but now I also want to use add my error modal. So for that, I need to import two things. The modal component, of course, from the components UI modal folder, and there the modal.js file. And since I want to place it next to it, I need the aux component from the aux folder in the HOC folder. So now I can wrap it all with aux like this and add the modal next to it. Don't use a self-closing tag here because in the modal, of course, I want to output something. For now, I'll just say something didn't work, just like that. Now we can fine tune this, but this is what I want to show right now. Now let's see if this works. If we save this, we now have our higher order component. Let's now use this on the Burger Builder. There I will import it at the top, so with error handler, starting with a lowercase character, because we're not going to use it in JSX. And now I'll navigate to my HOC folder and there to the with error handler folder and the with error handler JS file, of course. And then take that with error handler function we're importing and wrap the Burger Builder with it, like this. Now with this, if we go back to the with error handler function and set show, like this, so to true simply on the modal, if we save this and go back, we should always see something didn't work. Now obviously we only want to show this if we got an error. So we need to set show to something else. And that something else needs to come from the wrapped component. We need that information if it did fail. To get that information, we should add a second argument to our higher order function here. The Axios instance which was used, so that we can set up an error handler, a global error handler on it. Now to use that instance here, I will change this functional component into a class-based one. So here I will return class, which should now extend the component object from React. So I need to import that. Class extends component. As you can see, it's an anonymous class. I don't set up a name here because I never used that class. I return it here. It's a class factory essentially. With error handler creates these classes. Now in there, we clearly need a render method where we in the end return what we returned in our functional component here. So simply return that. Of course, props is now this props since we changed it to a class. We can get rid of that part down there now. And now with this, we can add component did mount here. And in component did mount, we can now set up our Axios listener. So on the Axios instance here, we can now set up our global intersetter, which also allows us to handle errors. So I'll add intersetters here, then response, and then with use add a function I want to use. So this function here will get the response and then do something with it, but I'm not really interested in that first argument, so I'll pass null here. The second argument is the one I'm interested in. That's the error case where I get an error. Here I then want to show my error modal. So for that I'll now add a state where I will simply set error to null initially. And in here I will then set, or call this set state, and set error to the error I'm getting here back from Firebase. And this happens to be an object which also contains an error message on the message property. You can simply console log that error to see how this object looks like. So now I'm setting that error here once we, well, got one. Now what I'll also do is I'll add a new intersetter for a request. So there I'll call use. And I'm not really interested in the request, but there's one thing I want to do in there. I want to call this set state and clear any errors so that whenever I send a request, I don't have my error set up anymore, so that I definitely clear it here. So now on the modal, I will only show it if this state error is not null essentially. And then in there I can output this state error, and then again there will be a message property on the error object returned by Firebase. Now there's one more thing we have to do. The modal component we created also exposes the clicked property which occurs when we click the backdrop. And in this case, of course, I also want to clear the error because then we clicked the modal. I don't want to show it anymore. I have to get rid of the error. So I'll also add clicked here. And there I will call a method I have to create in my with error handler component. I'll name it error confirmed handler. This simply is a method where I will call this set state and set error to null 2. And I will assign it here, this error confirmed handler. Now with this setup here, there's one more thing I want to do. This state error message, which I'm outputting here, will throw an error initially because the modal component is always present, even if we don't show it there. So what I'll do is I'll simply add a ternary expression where I'll say this state error question mark. Only if this is not null, then I'll output that. Otherwise, I'll output null, so I'll output nothing. Now with that, if I save this and go back to the application, we'll get cannot read property intersetters, which makes sense because we try to run this on Axios, but we don't receive Axios. We expect to get it as an argument, but in the Burger Builder where I use with error handler, I'm only passing the Burger Builder component, the wrapped component. So here I simply have to pass Axios, which we are importing here and which is our Axios instance. Now with that, there's one more thing we have to do. In our intersetters, we of course have to return something. When sending the request, we have to return the request config so that the request can continue. And for the response, I also want to implement a response handler here where I simply return the response. This is the shortest possible syntax for doing that. Now with that, if we save all of that and we go back to the application and we add a burger, this should still work. It does. We can still save a burger. Now let's mess something up and let's see if that also works. In the burger builder container where we sent the request, if we now change that URL and maybe remove the .json, which I said is a valid or an important part of the API endpoint for the Firebase database we're sending the request to here. So if we remove that, it should fail. So now if we try to store a burger, we indeed get a network error message here. Now closing by clicking on the backdrop doesn't work though, so let's quickly check why this is the case. Let me quickly have a look. I'm using the wrong prop. In the modal, of course, clicked is for the backdrop, the prop the backdrop exposes. The modal then uses modal closed. This is the method we try to execute here. So this is the property we should implement. So modal closed is the correct prop. Now with that again, if we try to send this with the wrong URL, we get the error, but we can dismiss it. So now we got global error handling in place, and I'm going to fix that orders URL again. So now we're handling both the success case and the error case. We're showing a loader as long as needed, and with that we got a robust application with a reusable higher order component, which we can wrap around any component which uses Axios to handle its errors.